The stars had always known him. Wherever he traveled, whatever storm carried him into the dark spaces between worlds, Superman had always trusted the quiet mathematics of the cosmos. Tonight, that trust was about to fail him. He had been chasing a strange fluctuation in the upper atmosphere, a pulse of energy that did not match any signature Kryptonian memory could name. It shimmered like heat above a distant fire, drawing him higher and higher, past the last blue veil of Earth's air, into a stillness that should have been peaceful. Instead, the void ahead of him tore open. There was no sound in that first instant, only a soundless white brilliance that swallowed him whole. He felt his body twist through directions that were not physical, through pressures that were not gravity, and then, without warning, he was falling. The sky reappeared around him with violent suddenness, and beneath that sky rose a skyline he did not recognize. New York City stretched out in vast neon patterns, its towers festooned with advertisements taller than clouds, its air heavier than any city he had ever flown above. Clark steadied himself in the air, breathing slowly, allowing his senses to catalog what he saw. It looked like Earth, it smelled like Earth, and yet something in it felt profoundly wrong, as though he had opened a familiar book only to find every word replaced with a slightly different meaning. He drifted lower, listening. The first thing he heard was cheering, not applause for kindness, not gratitude, cheering for spectacle. On 100 giant screens, a smiling costumed figure in bright red, white, and blue posed beside a shattered building, endorsing a brand of energy drink while camera crews swarmed the wreckage below. Superman's brow furrowed. He drifted further into the city and heard emergency sirens folded into celebrity theme music. Anchors on floating holographic displays discussed hero rankings and merchandise sales the way old broadcasts once discussed weather. Somewhere far beneath him, a commuter bridge groaned, its cables snapping one after another under the weight of rush-hour traffic. Instinct took over before thought could interfere. The bridge yielded under a rain of collapsing steel, but Clark was already beneath it, palms open, catching a full span of concrete before it could crush the cars trapped beneath. He held it aloft with the same quiet effort he had shown 10,000 times on his own world. Drivers stared up through their windshields with expressions he did not expect. Some cried. Others reached for their phones. Within seconds, the sky above him filled not with ambulances or rescue teams, but with news helicopters, their spotlights blinding, their reporters shouting into microphones. Who authorized this response? One voice demanded. Is this an unregistered soup? Another asked. Cameras zoomed and clicked. No one asked whether the survivors were injured. No one asked if the drivers were all right. Clark lowered the bridge gently onto reinforced supports, straightened his shoulders, and rose back into the sky before the questions could reach him. Somewhere below, a child pressed a small hand against a car window and mouthed a silent thank you. It was the only real gratitude he received. Inside Vought Tower, every screen in the executive suite lit up at once. Ashley Barrett stared at the frozen image of the flying stranger and felt the blood leave her face. There was no contract, no branding, no approval chain. Homelander watched from the far end of the room, a slow smile spreading across his lips. Miles away, in a cluttered safe house, Billy Butcher lit a cigarette as leaked footage played across his monitor, and his eyes narrowed into something more dangerous than curiosity. Superman drifted quietly across the city as the sun began to sink. He listened deeper than he had allowed himself to listen. Beneath the forced laughter, beneath the cheering, beneath the advertisements, he heard fear. He heard grief. He heard whispered mourning for people the cameras had never named. And on a skyscraper rooftop at sunset, Homelander descended slowly through the clouds, clapping. "Welcome," he said softly, "to the only world where God's answer to no one but us." Clark said nothing. He only watched. For a long moment on that rooftop, neither of them moved. The wind carried the smell of distant smoke and the low hum of the city's electric heartbeat. Clark studied the man before him the way a physician studies a wound, quietly, without judgment, searching for the shape of the injury beneath the surface. Homelander smiled the entire time, and there was something practiced in that smile, something learned rather than felt. "I thought we might talk," Clark said, "hero to hero." Homelander tilted his head with mild amusement. "Hero," he repeated, tasting the word as though it were an old joke. That's a nice piece of packaging. People buy it. But we both know what we really are. Power. And power doesn't answer questions. It writes them. Clark listened without interrupting. He had learned long ago that men revealed themselves most when they were allowed to speak freely. Homelander described his world with the casual confidence of someone who had never been challenged. Heroes existed because human beings needed idols to worship. Collateral damage was a marketing problem, not a moral one. The public did not want examples to follow. They wanted spectacles to cheer. Every sentence sounded like a shattered mirror held up to the ideals Clark had spent his entire life carrying, each fragment reflecting a distorted version of himself. When Clark spoke, his voice remained soft. "Power isn't an audience," he said. "It's a debt." Homelander laughed at that, and beneath the laughter Clark heard something small and frightened, something that had never been allowed to grow into a man. They parted without violence, but Clark understood, as he flew from that rooftop, that the conversation had been a declaration. By morning, the airwaves had turned against him. Vought's public relations division moved with the speed of a well-oiled weapon. Edited footage looped across every screen in the country, framing Superman as an unauthorized foreign soup of unknown origin. Analysts speculated about hostile intentions. Officials issued warnings. The bridge he had saved was recut into a scene of chaos he was accused of causing. Millions believed it within hours. It was not that they lacked the ability to think. It was that thinking had been trained out of them, replaced by the comfort of trusting whichever face appeared most often on their screens. Clark kept working. He pulled a family from a burning apartment in the Bronx without waiting for permission. He caught a subway car derailing beneath the East River. He never lingered. He never waved. Butcher watched all of it from a dozen surveillance feeds, and each new act cracked another old certainty inside him. He had built his life on the belief that no soup could resist the intoxication of an audience. This one did not even glance at the cameras. Within the seven, the fractures deepened. Queen Maeve, weary and tired of her own reflection, felt something almost like memory stir in her chest. Starlight watched the footage in secret and cried without knowing why. A-Train saw only a competitor climbing his ladder. The Deep offered his loyalty to whichever direction the ratings pointed. Stan Edgar, in his glass office high above the city, understood before any of them what the true danger was. A hero who could not be bought was not a military problem. He was an economic collapse in motion. Clark walked the streets at night as an ordinary man, hearing the whispers that never made the broadcasts. Families spoke of relatives crushed in staged rescues. Children spoke of celebrities they smiled at in public and feared in private. He could have ended it in an afternoon. He could have torn Vought Tower from its foundations. And that, precisely, was the problem. Forcing the truth would prove Homelander right. Then the explosion came. A downtown plaza engineered to look like a terrorist attack orchestrated by Homelander through manipulated soups, framed on Clark before the smoke had cleared. Public trust shattered before nightfall. Clark stood alone in the ruins after the crowds had fled. A figure emerged from the shadows behind him, cigarette glowing. "Either you're the greatest liar I've ever met," Butcher said quietly, "or you're exactly what this world forgot heroes were supposed to be." Vought called it Operation Dominion, and they announced it not to the public but to their shareholders. Within 24 hours, enhanced soups and experimental Compound V soldiers were mobilized across 3 continents. The stated goal was capture. The unspoken goal was demonstration. If Vought could bring the alien to heel on live broadcast, the myth of corporate control would survive another generation. If they could not, the illusion that had held their empire together for decades would begin to unravel in real time. Clark understood the trap before it closed. He could have ended most of the operation with a single sweep of speed and force. He did not. He refused lethal force from the first engagement, and that refusal became his greatest burden. Every squad Vought sent understood his restraint, and every commander exploited it. Hostages were placed in front of gun lines. Populated buildings became battleground. Explosive drones were set to detonate wherever civilians stood thickest. He was forced to think as much as he was forced to fight. calculating angles, redirecting collapsing walls, catching falling steel, intercepting missiles by the barest margin. He became less a warrior than a shield stretched across an entire city. Homelander watched from a private feed and laughed at what he saw. "This is not strength," he told Ashley. "This is a man who has already lost." The public broadcasts agreed. Every rescue was reframed as an act of destruction. Every act of mercy was edited into evidence of hesitation. Clark's face, calm and tired, was rendered menacing by careful color grading and ominous scoring. Millions who had once cheered him now feared him, and he could hear their fear as clearly as he could hear their heartbeats. Behind the noise, an underground counter-effort took shape. Butcher and Mother's Milk moved through Vought's darker corridors with the precision of men who had spent years mapping them. They planted evidence. They freed captives. They compiled testimonies from soups who had been discarded once their marketability faded. Starlight, working from within, leaked classified files proving Superman's innocence in the plaza bombing. The files reached 3 independent journalists within an hour, and by morning the first cracks appeared in the official narrative. Queen Maeve, who had spent years drinking to forget what she had once believed in, began questioning Homelander openly during 7 meetings. The fracture was small at first. It would not stay small. Yet Clark could not save everyone. He knew this from the beginning, and knowing did not soften it. A daycare collapsed in the Bronx before he could reach it. A woman fell from a shattered window on the far side of the harbor while he was pulling a train back onto its tracks. He carried each of those losses inside him with the weight of stones swallowed whole. Homelander sensed the wound and pressed it publicly, mocking him on a nationally broadcast interview, calling mercy the language of the weak, insisting that true power inspired fear and only fear could keep the world orderly. The world watched 2 visions of godhood emerge in real time. One built on domination, celebrated by cameras. One built on sacrifice, condemned by them. And still, quietly, in kitchens and subway stations and hospital waiting rooms, people began to notice. The turning point came at a coastal reactor complex in New Jersey. Vought had rigged the cooling system to fail catastrophically, timing the meltdown to Clark's inevitable arrival. He arrived. He held the collapsing core with his bare hands, absorbed the radiation into his own body, and vented the excess into the upper atmosphere in a controlled arc that spared millions of lives. Vought announced within the hour that Superman had caused the near disaster and been forced to contain his own recklessness. Even miracles, Clark realized, could be weaponized. That night, in a candlelit basement far from any camera, Butcher slid a decrypted file across the table. Vought's founders had been searching for ancient extraterrestrial energy signatures decades before Clark was born on this earth. Coordinates, dates, patterns. "You weren't blown here," Butcher said. Someone opened the door. Clark looked at the file for a long time and said nothing at all. The archives Vought had buried were not stored in servers or cloud vaults. They were kept the old way in reinforced rooms beneath the founders' original headquarters, on paper that had yellowed with the patience of a century. Butcher, Mother's Milk, Starlight, and Maeve moved through those rooms with the reverence of people opening a family grave. Clark watched from a distance, respecting that this was not his history to touch first. It was theirs. It had cost them everything. What they found rewrote the world they thought they had inherited. Vought's founders had not invented Compound V. They had reverse-engineered it, decades earlier, deep in a remote observatory in the mountains of what was then occupied Europe. An experiment intended to weaponize weather had struck something far stranger, a pulse of light without a source. A wound in reality that healed slowly and left residue behind. The founders had gathered that residue, studied it, distilled it, and shaped it into the compound that would eventually create every soup in the world. Compound V had never been science. It had been imitation. A copy of a signal none of them had ever fully understood. The dimensional fracture that had pulled Clark across realities had not been accidental. Vought's most recent experiments, buried 3 levels beneath the tower, had been attempts to open that old wound wider, to draw more of the original energy through. Kryptonian biology, unique in its resonance with solar radiation, had answered that call the way a tuning fork answers a struck bell. He had not fallen into this world. He had been wrung into it. Clark set the file down slowly. For a long time he did not speak. Somewhere in the silence, an old grief rearranged itself inside him, the quiet recognition that even his arrival had been engineered by the very corruption he had come to face. Homelander read the same file that night, alone, in a private chamber Vought did not know he had accessed. His hand trembled as he turned each page, and he did not understand at first why. He had never trembled before. When the truth settled, it settled the way a killing blow settles. He was not the pinnacle of anything. He was a shadow cast by a light he had never seen. A rough draft written by frightened men who had glimpsed something greater and tried to reproduce it in a lab. The original had finally arrived, and the original did not have to try. In a small apartment above a diner in Queens, Clark and Butcher argued quietly through the night. Butcher poured whiskey and did not drink it. Humanity, he said, always chooses monsters. They chose Homelander. They chose Vought. They chose the cheap comfort of a manufactured god over the harder work of being decent. Give them another century and they'll choose worse. Clark shook his head slowly. People choose what they believe is possible, he said. If they've only been shown monsters, they'll believe monsters are the only option. Show them something else, and they'll remember they had a choice all along. Neither of them convinced the other. Neither had expected to. But the argument itself was the first time in a decade that Butcher had spoken to another man without contempt. Outside, in ways too quiet for cameras to notice, Hope had begun to move. Starlight, unmasked and untelevised, walked into an ordinary church basement in Newark and spoke to 24 strangers about what she had seen. 24 became 100 by the next week. 100 became 1,000. Small acts of courage moved through the country the way water moves through stone, patiently, without spectacle. A bus driver refused to hand over a passenger to Vought security. A nurse released truthful medical records to a small newspaper. A teenage boy in Chicago stood in front of a Vought recruitment van and simply, silently would not move. Then the sky opened. High above Manhattan, where the Founder's original wound had never truly healed, a colossal cosmic rift tore across the heavens. Vought had woken something. It had not needed permission. The rift did not roar. It sighed. That was the worst part. A wound that, large in the fabric of reality, made a sound almost like breathing, slow and patient. And the city beneath it fell silent for a full minute before the screaming began. Above Manhattan, the sky rippled in colors no atmosphere had ever produced, and the light that spilled through those colors did not obey the geometry of the streets below. Entire city blocks began to flicker. On Fifth Avenue, a row of taxis vanished for 3 seconds and returned with different license plates. In Brooklyn, a subway platform briefly opened onto a beach no one recognized, and 2 commuters stepped through before anyone could stop them. They did not return. Reality had become a rumor of itself, and Vought, which had trained its empire on control, discovered too late that it had built its throne on a fault line. Ashley Barrett was the first to break. She fled the tower with a hard drive and never made it to the ground floor. Stan Edgar remained at his desk, calm as ever, arranging his affairs with the resigned dignity of a man watching his life's work confirm the wrong theory. Homelander refused to accept collapse. He appeared on every remaining broadcast and named Superman as the source of the catastrophe. Every soup still loyal to Vought was called to hunt the alien invader. Kill him, Homelander said, and reality itself will heal. The war that followed spread across 4 cities before nightfall. Clark met each attack with the same restraint, and each act of restraint cost him more than the last. The rift bled a strange, saturating radiation that dulled the yellow sun's touch. And for the first time in his life, Clark felt the slow, unfamiliar ache of vulnerability. A punch that should have glanced off his shoulder now bruised. A concussive blast that should have brushed past him now knocked him from the sky. He kept fighting anyway, because the people below him did not care about his physics. They cared whether he still stood. Butcher lost mother's milk during a raid on a Vought black site in New Jersey. He carried the body out himself and did not speak for 6 hours afterward. The old hatred rose in him again, warm and familiar, whispering that Superman's mercy was the reason his friends kept dying. He almost listened. He almost went back to who he had been. And then he remembered a bridge held aloft by 2 hands, and drivers weeping in their cars, and he set the whiskey down instead of drinking it. Maeve took a beam through the ribs, shielding a school bus from a collapsing overpass. Starlight nearly bled out on the steps of the Vought press building after transmitting the final archive to every independent news feed on the continent. Neither of them died that night, but neither of them walked away untouched. The cost of choosing compassion in a world that rewarded cruelty was written into their bodies in a language no camera could edit. Homelander found Clark above the harbor as the sun sank behind a fractured skyline. The battle that followed was less a fight than a confession. Homelander threw everything he had, every fear, every insecurity, every carefully hidden wound, and Clark absorbed each blow with a sorrow that only made Homelander angrier. Twice, mid-combat, a stray beam of unstable energy from the rift would have killed the man in red, white, and blue. Twice, Clark shielded him with his own body. "Why?" Homelander screamed, the word cracking in his throat. "Why do you keep saving me?" "Because you were made to be feared," Clark said quietly, "and someone has to remind you that you were still born." Homelander struck him then with a blow that split the sky. Clark answered it, not with fury but with a long, patient look, and for the first time in his life Homelander felt something worse than pain. He felt seen. Clark broke away, spent the last of his strength sealing the northern edge of the rift, and fell from the sky like a slow, tired star. The city watched their final protector strike the ground. Darkness rolled over the horizon and did not stop. The world was told Superman was dead before the dust of his fall had settled. Homelander delivered the news himself, standing on the wreckage of an overpass with the sun behind him and the wind arranged just so. He spoke of loss with practiced sincerity. He offered himself as the natural successor. He waited for the cheers he had been born to receive. They did not come. Something had changed in the hours between Clark's fall and Homelander's speech. In Queens, an off-duty firefighter pulled 3 strangers from a collapsing tenement without a camera in sight. In Newark, a group of teenagers formed a human chain across a flickering street where reality had gone thin, guiding lost commuters back into the stable side of the world. In Chicago, a nurse organized her entire hospital into an evacuation grid without a single soup assisting her. Ordinary people had watched a man from another sky choose them again and again, and something in that stubborn kindness had woken them up. Homelander finished his speech to a silence that felt closer to judgment than grief. He flew back to Vought Tower with a smile that no longer reached his eyes. Beneath a collapsed pier on the Hudson, Clark opened his eyes. The world above him was dim and unsteady, but he could feel a slender warmth returning to his chest, a whisper of the yellow sun bleeding through the cracks in the rift. Butcher knelt beside him with a canteen and a rare, careful expression. "You look terrible," Butcher said. Clark almost laughed. "That's fair." He rose slowly. He did not rise as an invulnerable god returning to punish an unworthy world. He rose as a tired man who had understood, at last, what he had been asked to do. Defeating Homelander alone would not save this universe. This universe had never needed a champion. It had needed permission to believe in itself again. Clark had spent the last weeks giving that permission, and the people had begun to take it. His final task was to make certain the door stayed open. The Convergence gathered at Vought Tower as the rift bled color across the entire eastern seaboard. Butcher led the resistance up through the lower levels, his coat torn, his face bloodied, his eyes clearer than they had been in years. Starlight moved through the panicked civilians outside, organizing them into corridors of safety with a calm that surprised even her. Maeve, ribs bound and armor scorched, walked into the tower's main lobby beside Butcher without saying a word, because words were no longer needed between them. Even a handful of former Vought soups, discarded by the company and radicalized by Starlight's transmissions, arrived to fight on the side they had once been paid to destroy. Above them, in the sky at the top of the tower, Clark met Homelander a final time. The battle that followed was the largest either universe had ever recorded, and yet the story of it was not in the destruction, it was in the choices. Clark did not fight to win, he fought to buy time. Every punch he threw was aimed away from the rift. Every barrier he raised protected the streets below. Homelander, sensing that Clark was not trying to defeat him, unraveled slowly in the middle of the fight, striking harder, faster, wilder, as if intensity alone could force Clark to admit that this was really about supremacy. It was not. It never had been. When Homelander finally paused, breathing hard, bleeding from wounds he had not known he could receive, Clark hovered in front of him and offered him something no one in his life had ever offered. "Stop," Clark said. "Come with me. Help me close it. You don't have to be what they made you." Homelander looked at him for a long moment. Something in his eyes flickered. A boy who had once been kept in a white room, a boy who had been taught that love was a weakness to be starved out of him. The flicker passed. Rage returned. Because rage was familiar and mercy was not, he attacked one last time. Clark caught the blow, held Homelander in place gently, almost tenderly, and closed his eyes. The compassion was the defeat. Homelander understood that as the fight ended. He had not been beaten by force. He had been outshone. The rift screamed above them. Clark rose into it alone. He turned his gaze downward once, taking in the resistance, the injured, the strangers holding one another in the streets. And he smiled at them the way a father smiles at children he is trusting to grow up without him. Then he poured his life into the wound, and the sky closed. He was gone. The Empire did not fall in a single dramatic collapse. Empires never do. Vought was undone the way old dams are undone, by 1,000 small fractures widening at once until the wall could no longer pretend to hold. Investigations opened in 6 countries within a week of the rift closing. Journalists who had spent years silenced by contracts and threats found their voices again, and their voices found readers who were, at last, prepared to listen. Compound V's origin was made public in a single leaked archive that spread faster than any denial. The founder's notes, preserved in that yellowed paper Butcher had carried out of the tower, ended the debate before it could begin. Vought. Tower stood empty for months, its lobby patrolled only by dust and pigeons. Advertisements peeled slowly from its outer walls. Children walked past it on their way to school and asked their parents what the building had once been, and the parents, for the first time, told the truth. The abandoned towers became a kind of memorial, not to the company but to the era humanity had almost surrendered to it. The greatest transformation was quieter. It lived in classrooms and kitchens and hospital corridors. Children stopped asking to become powerful and began asking to become good, and their parents, who had grown up dreaming of fame, did not correct them. Anonymous acts of courage began to appear in local newspapers, unbranded, unmonetized, unclaimed. A woman who pulled a stranger from a burning car refused to give her name to the reporter. A boy who tutored younger kids in a shelter asked that no one photograph him. It was a small thing, and it was the entire thing. Butcher visited a grave often that autumn, one that held only a jacket and a set of dog tags, because there had been no body left to bury. He would sit on the cold ground and speak in a low voice, catching mother's milk up on the world's slow mending. He never said Superman's name aloud in those visits, but he thought it often. He had spent his life believing that violence was the only honest language left in a corrupt world, and a man from another sky had shown him that the honest language had been there all along, quieter and harder and stronger. He laid his war down. He did not pick it back up. Maeve retired quietly to a lake house upstate with a partner she had once refused to acknowledge, and she learned, slowly, how to be a person rather than a product. Starlight became a teacher of sorts, though she resisted the title, moving city to speak with young soups emerging in the aftermath, asking them not to be heroes but to be responsible. The surviving 7 were dismantled by the courts, and those who wished to keep serving the public did so under a new framework in which trust was earned rather than manufactured. High above Earth, on clear nights, a faint blue flicker sometimes appeared among the stars. Scientists called it an atmospheric echo of the closed rift, a harmless residual glow. Ordinary people, without saying so aloud, believed something else. They believed the last sun had not been destroyed by the ceiling. They believed he had been folded into the barrier itself, a witness rather than a warden, watching a world that no longer needed him at its center. The children who noticed the light waved at it sometimes. Their parents pretended not to see them do it, and then, later, when the children were asleep, went to the windows and looked up themselves. In the empty upper decks of what had once been Vought Tower, a security camera long forgotten by its operators recorded something no one ever reviewed. A shimmer in the corridor, a shape almost taking form. A distant silhouette, unfamiliar, approaching from a reality no telescope could name, drawn by the same wounds Superman had once passed through, somewhere beyond the closed sky. Another symbol of hope had heard the story of what one man had done in a world that did not deserve him, and had chosen to answer. The universe held its breath, waiting to see who else was already on the way.